Hello and welcome to Changing World. My name is Anthony Smith, and joining me today is a Mr. Kam Knight. Kam Knight is a coach, writer and author of several best-selling books in the area of mental performance such as memory, concentration and productivity. While growing up, Kam had tremendous difficulty focusing and controlling his mind and emotions. This kept him from performing well academically and on a personal level. Over the past 15 years, Kam has dedicated his life to understanding, exploring and managing this mayhem. In his quest, he has left no stone unturned, willing to go anywhere and try anything, including working with shamans in the jungles of the Amazon, visiting ashrams in Asia, and everything in between. This has given him insight into the mind and human condition that is unparalleled. Kam Knight's books and courses are a distillation of what he's learned on this incredible journey. So, welcome to the show, Kam. How are you?
Thanks, Anthony. I'm glad to be here. I'm doing good. How about yourself?
That's great. I'm doing fine here. Now, I'm coming to you from London, and you're over in the US, aren't you? Now, you grew up in Chicago, but I know you've moved about a bit, haven't you?
Yeah, I have. So currently I'm in warmer weathers because Chicago is brutally cold this time of the year.
Right.
So I'm right now in Austin, down south.
Austin, Texas. Well, that's nice. That's nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's. I hope that's given listeners a good idea of who you are. You know, obviously, so a bit about your background.
Yeah.
I had a question here, which I've written down, which is, I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about your background, the problems you had growing up, and how you eventually managed to overcome those difficulties. Could you say a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So as far back as I can remember, I've had an unquiet mind. In addition to hyperactive thoughts, I had extreme difficulty learning, paying attention, sitting still, organizing my ideas, communicating, interacting. Anything that involved the mind, I had tremendous challenges around.
Right.
So now when people hear this, they immediately think attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. Though I would be lucky if it were only ADHD. Unfortunately, it was much more severe than that. My emotions were raging and cycling really intensely. Some days I was lethargic with no motivation and barely able to get out of bed. Mm-hmm. Then other days hyper and out of control. Some days I was happy and wanted to hug the world. And other days like raging with anger. And when people hear this, they usually think bipolar. Unfortunately, it was, I wish it were only that as well. I mean, I was literally changing states constantly. Frequently, I would see the dazed look on people's eyes when one of these shifts would happen. It's as if I turned into another person. And to really describe this state, I felt like I was going to spontaneously combust, but the tragedy of it was I never did. So if you can imagine what that was like growing up. And it's kind of interesting, people always told me that I was very intelligent. However, I wasn't really able to do anything with that intelligence. My mental challenges really kept me from performing well in school and affected all areas of my life, academic, professional, and especially relationship. And growing up, I thought it was just a phase I was going through. And I think that's what the expectation was with the people around me. Because, when you're younger, it's not unusual to be a little bit hyper and out of control. And the expectation is that you'll grow out of it. And I was hoping that was the case, but that wasn't. As I got older, it kind of got worse and worse. And once I graduated college, it was kind of like at the forefront of my life. As I mentioned, really affecting everything, including my professional and personal life. And so at that point, I had decided to kind of get a handle on it. And, I tried various different things. And it was a big challenge that wasn't something that could just be solved easily. So that this is what really led me on a journey across 100 countries around the world and trying everything I have to learn about the mind to, kind of gain a bit of inner calm and clarity that I can happily say I have more of now.
Well, that's great. So obviously, that sounds like quite a journey that you've
Yeah.
been on. All those different places that you've visited. Um, Now, the question I have for you next, it kind of
Yeah.
leads on from that first question, and I'd like to ask you, what were the major breakthroughs which occurred for you, and how did these happen?
Okay. So when it comes to major breakthroughs, I can't say there was one big turning point that changed things for me. It was all a stepping stone.
Okay.
So I had a mindset that I would try anything and everything, whatever systems, processes, advice, medicines, or whatever I heard about or was recommended, I'd give it a shot. And so they were all like stepping stones, meditation helped me take the next step,
Hmm.
overcoming anxiety helped me take the next step,
Yep.
yoga helped me develop self-control, and everything else. But if there was a major turning point, there would be two main things. And one was realizing that what was going on internally for me wasn't what was going on for everybody else. I thought what was going on for me was just normal and everybody kind of was experiencing it. It's just that everyone else had better self-control. They had a better handle on it. They had stronger will. And I kind of accepted the word, the programming from people around me growing up that I was lazy, had no willpower, and all of that. And what I realized was that I had some thing, like some intensity, even insanity going on that was making things difficult to manage. And the reason other people seemed so calm and collected wasn't because they had stronger willpower, stronger self-control, or just were, better at it. It was that they didn't have those things coming
Hmm.
up to really cause chaos and havoc. So realizing that was a really big turning point. And another turning point was that one of the biggest realizations I had was that 90% of the things I was doing, I wasn't choosing to do, nor was something I wanted to do. I didn't want to act goofy in front of peers and get laughed at, but that's what would come out. I didn't want to forget my keys or important deadlines and appointments, but that's what would happen. I wanted to follow a course of action, but for one reason or another, I actually couldn't. So it was just sort of happening. The thoughts that I was thinking, the emotions I was feeling, the things I was saying, as well as the actions I was taking, I wasn't intending to do those things. And especially after like reading an inspiring book or listening to an audio program that taught me how to act and think differently, I was like, okay, I know what to do. I want to do it, but for one reason or another, I couldn't get myself to do it. And that's when I had the awakening that majority of not just myself, but other people, we're not in control of what's going on. And it's, our unconscious is kind of doing its own thing, and we're just kind of, in a way, almost along for the ride. And so it really shifted my focus from going from trying to find tips and advice on what to do and really going inward and changing the unconscious so it acts in accordance to what it is that I wanted to do or what was societally acceptable, if that makes sense.
Right, right. So, tell me a little bit about the people that you met and obviously traveling all different corners of the world.
Yeah.
What people had a major influence on you and actually helped steer you in the right direction?
Well, it was a long journey, so I've had a lot of people come my way that have helped me. But if I can share just a few stories, a couple that could give you and the listeners an idea of the type of help that I did receive. I remember the first day of my travel journeys, I landed in Colombia, and Prior to that, I was thinking to my head, once you start traveling, everything's gonna be cool. You're gonna have some free time. You're gonna have a lot more time to just kind of be with yourself and not have the pressure of the outside world, creating the feelings that you are. Because I wasn't happy, I was stressed, I had all these things. And I had put everything away into storage, I had quit my job, I had some time, I had some money put aside, and at the time I had published a few books where I was getting royalties. I just thought everything was gonna work itself out, but it didn't. I was still feeling the same way, the same, just the struggles I had. And I remember my first day, I was having lunch with this guy named John, and I was telling him my frustration, and he's like, guys like you and I, we come from a Western culture where we're just kind of conditioned to think it's about the material success and the money and the house and the cars and all of that. And we're missing these key things that we humans are built to have, like physical contact. Not just like interaction, but actual physical contact. And he was talking about how we're mammals and we need that. And if we don't get that, it manifests. It manifests in anxiety and other emotional issues as well as mental issues. And at the time, this was back in 2011, nobody was really talking about it, or at least nobody in my circles. And this was like a very novel concept. And it made sense how important interactions and relationships as well as physical contact was important. And that really shifted the way how I traveled. So instead of being like a loner on my journey, I made it a point to connect with as many people as I could. I made it a point to travel in hostels and stay in dorm rooms as opposed to private rooms, because it would force me to interact and engage with people. Yeah. And that was a really huge key that I learned early on in the journey that shifted my travel so I can engage and interact with more people. And you know what? Part of my struggles was that because I was so focused on the success side of things, I tended to isolate myself, and that over time that's not healthy. But shifting gears this way was really, really important. So that was one important contact I had. And shortly after, I was traveling through Central America. I went into Panama and then to Costa Rica and then into Nicaragua. I ended up in, I think, a town called Granada. I ended up staying in a hostel. It was a fairly inexpensive hostel. And it was a new hostel, so there was nobody there. And one of the days, this woman checked in. She was from Germany, young. She just finished school, probably in her 20s. And she was out doing her customary travel before she started college. Being new into the traveling sphere and kind of not really sure what I was doing, I was cool, somebody who was like really confident about it and had no issues and have no reservations about exploring different areas. It just came so natural to her, but it didn't to me. And I was thinking to myself, here is a woman who is, barely 20 in a country halfway across the world, and she can just kind of move about and do the travel thing as if it's a natural thing, a natural process, where I had a lot more anxiety and reservations and like, be careful, don't go here and don't do this. And things just simple as, figuring out where a bus stop was to take us to another city, I wouldn't have thought to do. I would have thought it was much more difficult. But seeing her, it was like, wow, like I'm overthinking it. So that was a really cool encounter that I had with her that really opened my mind to be less anxious, but more open to the whole experience, and that people weren't out to get me and anything like that. And especially out there, like people are really friendly and very easy to engage and approach and ask for information. And if I can just add one more story, is through my travel journeys, I've really traveled, to all corners of the globe. I have had friends follow my story and be like, wow, Kam, you really leave no stone unturned. And really, when I was traveling, I didn't. I was in the jungles of Amazon. I hiked active volcanoes. I've even hiked glacier ice sheets of Greenland, the second largest ice sheet in the world. And what I'm trying to say is that through that experiences, I got to interact with people and cultures from all over. From the most isolated indigenous culture, the Kuna in Panama, to the Inuits in Greenland, to the Maasai in Africa, as well as indigenous cultures in Tim and Nagara, as well as Aboriginals in Australia, but also everything in between, Western cultures, semi-Western cultures, and whatnot. And what's really interesting is with all those one-on-one interactions, I really got to see that, we humans are all the same. If you cut us, we bleed. If we lose someone, it hurts. If we do something too much, it's not good. If we don't do something enough, it doesn't stick. And it's easy to kind of say this, but to actually experience it, like when you're in the Amazon in a very isolated indigenous culture and you see them acting and reacting the way we do, having concern about what to eat for that day, and then after you have, dinner and meal with everybody, you're laughing and all that. It was just a very eye-opening experience.
Yeah, well, obviously, having the privilege of meeting all those different people from different cultures, it must have an influence on you, I suppose, because it's not something most people have done in their lives, is it? I mean, obviously most people do travel, but as you say, to have that interaction with all those different cultures must have given you some perspective, which helped you in your life, I would have said.
Yeah.
So let's come back to more recently. You've written several books, haven't you?
Right.
One of them is called Concentration.
Yeah.
And another one is to do with creative visualization, isn't it? So let's just talk about that for a minute. I mean, talking about, for example, memory and concentration techniques.
Yeah.
What can you share with our listeners? Which, what sort of techniques could you just share right now, which could help people in a practical, everyday sense, which they can actually apply in some way?
Sure. So I can share a really simple technique that is not only very effective but very practical to our day-to-day lives.
Okay.
One technique that can help us with both the memory and the concentration. But before I talk about the technique, I want to talk about a couple of principles, because as it relates to memory and concentration, it's really important to understand the principles, because once we understand the principles, we understand why the technique is so important. And once we understand principles, we also understand it also encourages us to actually use the techniques. And one of the most important principles I can teach as it relates to memory is not to rely on your natural processes to remember information. As humans, we put way too much faith in our memory. We'll come across a great idea, important fact, obvious advice, and think that it's too important and too obvious to forget. And sure enough, we'll forget. And then we'll do it again. We'll come across an even more important instruction or valuable advice or obvious fact and think that this time it's just too great, too important, too valuable, or too obvious to forget. And sure enough, we forget again. And what's interesting is that we humans live our lives like this, constantly forgetting important information coming our way. And what I want to let people know is that majority of the information that we're looking for or seeking, we've already actually come across. And more than likely, we forgot. And you hear the phrase that history repeats itself. Well, it repeats itself in our own lives. because we're constantly forgetting information and making the same mistakes over and over. And I want the listeners to understand that as humans, we forget as much as 80% of what we hear, see, and learn within a few hours of hearing, seeing, and learning it. So that's not within a few months or a few weeks or a few days, but within a few hours. So just because something is important and great doesn't mean we'll remember it. We need to take action if we want to ensure that we remember it. So that's a really important principle as it relates to memory. An important principle as it relates to concentration is that, developing concentration isn't very easy. It can be quite challenging. And there's several reasons for that. But one of the main reasons is that our unconscious mind comes from the wild. It came from it evolved over hundreds and millions of years through the wild. Whereas our conscious mind, the thinking mind, the human mind, it's only been around for a few 100,000 years. So in a sense, concentration is a battle. It's a battle between where your conscious wants to put attention on, and where your unconscious is designed or has evolved to put attention on. And it's important to understand where our unconscious is designed to put our attention, so we can be aware of how it is diverted. So I'll just talk about a few of them. So first and foremost is joy and pleasure. Our mind is drawn towards things that give us pleasure. And I don't know if many people realize, but joy and pleasure, there's a purpose to it. The purpose is to pull us towards the thing the mind thinks would be good or beneficial. So if the mind feels like something is going to be good for us, it'll pull us toward it by flooding our body with pleasure and joy. Okay. Another thing is habits. Habits are designed to keep us in a routine or pattern of behavior. And in their efforts, habits will do everything they can to ensure that we stick to that routine or pattern of behavior. If they didn't, they wouldn't be very good at what they did. So our concentration and focus will veer towards anything that supports a habit and against anything that goes against the habit. And I'll talk about one more important key, which is social proof. So we humans, we're pack animals. If you go around the world, you'll see that we humans have evolved and live in packs or groups or communities and societies. That was our key trait in survival. As a result, our mind is constantly looking at what others are doing. And if some behavior is acceptable or is popular, then it'll pull our attention towards it. Or if a behavior or activity has a stigma associated with it or is seen as uncool or not popular, our mind will make us avoid it like it's a plague. Even if the activity could be good for us or could be useful or we might actually enjoy it, but the fact that our unconscious sees that, hey, this isn't popular, this has a stigma, whatever, it'll make it difficult for us to pay attention to it. Mm-hmm. So those are the principles. One is, as humans, we forget 80% of what we hear, see, and learn in a very short period. And the other is that as concentration is really a battle between where you want to put attention versus where your unconscious is designed and has evolved to put attention. Now, there's this one technique called retrieval that can help us with both. And retrieval is simply recalling information that you have heard, watched, or read instead of rereading, rewatching, or rehearing it. For example, after reading a chapter in a book, you close the book and try to call to mind everything you read from memory as opposed to going back to the book or looking at your notes. Or after hearing a show like this, afterwards trying to recall as much as they can of the show and some of the takeaways, important takeaways, as well as actionable steps. And retrieval has shown to not only be one of the most powerful memory aids, but is shown to be more powerful than multiple memory aids. And there's a very important reason for why. Because the real challenge of remembering is not with putting information into your brain. That's actually quite easy and natural for the brain to do. The real challenge is in getting it out. And I can illustrate with a couple examples. So, Anthony, if I were to ask you to recite lyrics to your favorite song, you would probably find it difficult to do. But if the song were playing, you could sing along to the tune with no problems, right?
Right.
Yeah. Or if I were, or have you ever read a book that you thought you hadn't, but then as you start reading, you're like, hey, wait, I remember reading this before, and then all of a sudden the plot starts unfolding and you start remembering all the characters that will show up.
Yeah, I think that can happen, especially if you watch a film on television and you don't realize that you may have watched it quite a few years ago.
Exactly.
And you can actually forget that you've seen it before.
Exactly. And so these examples illustrate that memories can be in our head, but seem like that they're lost and forgotten.
Right.
And the reason they seem like they're lost and forgotten is that we haven't practiced getting the information out. And retrieval helps us practice getting information out. And if we can practice retrieval with whatever information we want to remember, not just review the information over and over, but after we've come across something that's important, just think about what we learned, how much we learned, and all the details of it. It will reinforce our memory. And there's two ways to go about doing retrieval. One is to do a daily review. So at the end of the day, think about everything that happened during that day. We can start from the morning and work our way up to the evening, calling up all the details, such as what we had for breakfast, what we did after breakfast, the conversations we had, the things that we committed to. Mm-hmm. Just that simple recall at the end of the day will reinforce that memory.
Okay.
And so that's one way to do retrieval. And the other way is to do it right after we have encountered information or experience. So for somebody in business, after they come out of a meeting, as they're walking back to their desk or to another meeting, they think about everything that was discussed in the meeting. Who spoke? What were some of the things that were said? What were some of the things that are now on the person's plate to take care of, as well as some of what other people had said in the meeting, so it could be fresh. For a student, retrieval could be done, after they get out of a class, as they're about to walk to another class or home. They think about everything that the teacher discussed, the topics that came up, the details that were used to support the topics. And just taking a few minutes to do a retrieval like this can really help us reinforce the information. And the reason retrieval works so well for concentration as well is that if you start retrieving information on a regular basis, the mind starts to realize that whatever you're doing, whatever experiences you're having, or whatever information that's coming your way, it will be called on by you later. Mm-hmm. So it does a better job of paying attention in the moment and recording that information.
Yeah, well, that certainly makes sense. It's rather like understanding that the mind is the memory is like a muscle in a way, isn't it?
Yes.
The more that you exercise it, probably the better it's going to be.
Yeah.
So what you're saying, if I can just recap, is that you're saying consciously try to exercise that memory muscle.
Yes.
And in so doing, the more that you work at it, the more efficient it's going to be.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the way we humans are built, we can do some really amazing things like sing and dance and play all sorts of sports. But we're not born doing those things.
No.
We have to learn and practice it.
Sure.
And the same thing occurs with our memory and specifically retrieval. Because a lot of us, especially growing up and going through school, we were taught to put information into our head. So we built the muscles to put information into our head. We never built the muscle to pull the information out of our head,
right,
to retrieve. And if we want to improve our memory, we need to improve retrieval. And the way to improve retrieval is to just practice retrieving information and building that muscle to retrieve information.
Yeah, that certainly makes sense. I think I've come across that sort of concept before. somewhere. But yeah, it's certainly obviously that is the way to do it.
Yeah.
Now, shall we move on to talking about issues that are going to be affecting the world?
Yeah.
Because I know you said you had some views on that. I mean, for example, what would you say are the most important changes going on around us, and how are these going to impact our world in the future?
Okay, so having kind of traveled to nearly 100 countries and to nearly all corners of the globe, even isolated parts of the world,
Yeah.
and seeing just how alike we are as humans, one of the things that I'm noticing is that we actually aren't changing that much. We are kind of still working within our limitations of our unconscious patterns and unconscious drives of, ego and jealousy and anger and all that. And I think one of the biggest challenges for humanity is that as humans, many of the things that we're doing is outside our conscious control. We're not aware of them. And even if we were aware of them, they're difficult to control. So, for example, we might see someone have something, and the mind will flood our body with a rush of jealousy. And that jealousy can either motivate us to work hard to get it, or it could make us want to take it from them using any means possible. And this is built into our core. It's not just something we can overcome. And the same occurs with anger. When we get angry, that feeling causes us to act and react in ways that are unhealthy. We often do things that we regret later. And it's the emotion of anger that causes the behavior, not our logical thinking mind. And we don't necessarily choose a feeling. The mind just releases it, and we're just kind of acting out based on the emotion that we're feeling. And what's really more important to understand is what makes things more challenging is that we don't realize we're in the feeling. When we're feeling angry, we may not be aware that we're angry. It just comes out of nowhere, and we act on it without realizing the harm it could be doing to others. And the longer we stay in a feeling and are unaware of it, the more we could be not only destructive to ourselves, but more importantly, get into a pattern of destructive behavior toward others. And, it kind of goes back to one of the key realizations I had in my journey of growth is that many of the things that we're doing, we're not consciously choosing to do. It's just kind of happening. We humans are impulsive beings, and our impulses come from having to survive in the wild. So we have a lot of wild in us. And those parts are designed to act without thinking about it. And so there are parts of our mind that is acting before we come to a decision. And so I think as humans and humanity, we need to really understand that, because it's not all just a matter of choice. It's understanding our unconscious reactions and behaviors that can have detrimental effects without, our conscious awareness or even control.
Yeah. I mean, this is the thing. It's the kind of the balance between being able to reason and just acting on emotion. Obviously, everybody has a mixture of that. Sometimes we act on emotion, or we act on logical reason, or a mixture of the two, I suppose.
Yeah.
So. I mean, this obviously there are major problems in the world, and as you say, this is indicative of human nature in general, isn't it?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there are wars going on, and there are bad things happening, corruption in the world, and this has been going on for. Well, since mankind has been on the earth, I suppose.
Yeah.
So it's not something that we've yet been able to master. I think is the assessment of that is that we're still not fully in control of our emotional state.
Yeah.
Most people, you'd say that for most people, although I suppose the examples you could take of people who have kind of transcended that is some of these yogis,
Yeah.
or the spiritual masters who've dedicated their lives to transcendence, to transcending the basic human instincts and the basic human emotions, and obviously that takes a lot of effort, a lot of sacrifice, but it's a goal that many people have aspired to. That it's a decision they've had to consciously make, I suppose, and just say, they want to look inward, and not place a priority on materialism, and kind of look inward and see what the answers are within.
Yeah. It does require going inward and doing a lot of inward work. And in my journey of healing, that's what I needed to do. That for me to get to a point where I had a little bit more self-control and be sitting here calmly talking to you in a way where I can actually make intelligible sense with my words, because in the past that wasn't possible. And it's not an easy journey. And I think if one thing that I can say, I think one of the challenges that we have is that as humans, we tend to think that our more evolved brains, our neocortex, our thinking brain, have more control and influence on us. But that's not the case. It's actually our more primitive parts, our mammalian and reptilian brains, that have more power and influence over us. In fact, our mammalian and reptilian brains, they're designed to be able to act even while our human thinking brain is coming to a decision. So we can be acting without having fully rationalized or thought through what we want to do. And if we can understand that our primitive parts have more control and influence, it can create this shift that, hey, I need to do a little bit more work in controlling the parts of myself that, gets triggered unconsciously through impulses, through emotions, through basic primal drives.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. I mean, obviously there are instincts built into us, and sometimes we have to try and overcome that. And obviously, what separates us from most of the animals is that we have the ability to be a bit more detached and to think rationally and to apply a bit of logic. Whereas obviously, I don't want to say animals are unintelligent, because I think animals can show a lot of intelligence in certain circumstances. But what's supposed to separate human beings from the animals is that we're more advanced in our thinking, and we can, to some extent, we override our instincts whenever necessary, whenever it's appropriate, I think.
Yeah. No, I agree. The one thing we do have is the ability to override some of our instinctual responses and habits. But as you had mentioned, and as we've been talking, it doesn't just come naturally. We're not born with it. It's unlike instinct. It needs to be trained. Instinct is something we're just kind of born to do.
Yeah.
Whereas being a little bit more rational thinking and refraining our instinctual responses takes a bit of conditioning, discipline, work to be able to achieve. Though I do have a question. What are your thoughts in terms of AI and kind of like the future of AI? Because if we humans are, the way we are, we kind of have we have a considerable amount of intelligence, but we also are carrying with us the wild. And those two kind of really make things challenging. But I feel like if we can start designing AI to not have the limitations that we do,
Mm.
that would be like a great progression for the advancement of, I don't want to say humanity, but life in general, or of intelligence in general.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's been. I mean, AI is actually a huge matter of debate and discussion, as you probably know.
Yeah.
And there's been a lot of prominent figures come out and say that we need to be very careful about
Hmm.
artificial intelligence, simply because over the coming years it's going to increase at an alarming rate.
Right.
I mean, the latest development that is supposed to be coming in, well, it is coming in, is 5G. And
Yes.
5G, the implications of 5G are that there'll be more, um, basically, it's kind of like artificial intelligence in that there'll be more kind of intelligent tools which will almost take away some of our responsibilities. In fact, they probably will take away our
Yeah.
responsibilities. So the more that this artificial intelligence gains ground, really we have to question: will it be taking away some of our abilities to make decisions? Because then it becomes a matter of debating how good is artificial intelligence for the
Yeah.
benefit of mankind, and will it kind of become a dominant force, too dominant?
Yeah.
It is, I think, what we have to contemplate.
So if we are, if our discussion is about, the future of humanity as well as the future of advancement, I kind of want to propose something, and I don't know if I'm being a bit overboard with it, but really kind of thinking of humanity not as something unique, but just not the end of the chain, but a link in the chain of evolution. So we've evolved over hundreds of millions of years to where we are now.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of discussion going around as if like we need to preserve humanity, we need to preserve humans, and there's a lot of talk. Elon Musk is at the forefront of it, as well
Right.
as a lot of other leaders, thinkers, as well as people in general, doing things to create peace. And given what I have shared about how humans are, we have both the ability to do good, but at the same time, we have wild in us and have the ability to do bad. And it's built into our core. And it's not like we can just sedate the wild parts of ourselves or the anger or the jealousy parts. We can't go in and operate and remove those things. We evolved to as a system to operate with everything that we have. And we see when we take anti-anxieties or antidepressants or antipsychotics, it will help us in the short term, but over time it can create side effects and actually be detrimental over long term. It's
Yep.
because we're trying to like sedate parts of ourselves that we need to operate with. But what if we were able to build AI that didn't have those destructive qualities? We can take control of the evolution and make AI extend beyond what we can, and we can be part of it and make it less like us in the bad ways and more like us in the ways that are going to be, allow it to flourish.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's an interesting point you made. I think uh, you know, at the end of the day, we've got to decide what the place of AI will be. Will it be there as a tool to aid us, or will it be, as some people have speculated, that it could turn into a dominating force,
Yeah.
and take away some of our freedom? So this is the central issue of the debate,
Yeah.
is that is it a good or a bad thing? I think, if you're looking way into the future, then it's just almost impossible
Yeah.
to predict anything. But I think in the short term, most people would like to think of it as a tool which is going to help mankind.
Yeah.
And I'm firmly convinced of that. Obviously, right now we have so many computers in our lives,
Hmm.
and those computers have helped to organize society. Let's be honest.
Right.
So many things are computerized because it's more efficient, and it enables processes to work efficiently. Even just going down to the shop and being able to buy the food that you want, because those processes of having the food delivered and importing it, etc., getting it transported, those processes are computerized
Yeah.
for the efficiency of being able to access what we want to access. So, I just think it's as far as I can see, it's something which can help mankind, as long as it doesn't go to the extreme.
Okay.
That's my view.
And if for one extreme, what would be the bad in it? I guess. Like.
Well, yeah, there again, we're just speculating now. But I mean, of course, we can always go back to the book 1984, written by George Orwell,
Yeah.
in which he paints a picture of mass control, doesn't he? The fact that
Yeah.
everyone's being watched and monitored, and they can hardly do anything. They kind of lost their freedom.
Yeah.
So I think obviously that's one extreme. But as you touched on before, another extreme might be that humans will not be able to express their emotions, because it could be, what if we had a situation where AI decided that human emotion is bad, or it can be bad?
Yeah.
Then there might. I mean, this is all speculation,
Right.
but I'm just saying that yes, certain prominent figures, as you mentioned, Elon Musk, have
Yeah.
pointed out that there are dangers to this, because another interesting statistic is that computing power doubles roughly every 2 years or so, something like that. So we've got more and more powerful computers, and then the next step is quantum computing,
Right.
which is, it's becoming more, the ability to fit more and more computing power into a certain physical space.
Right.
So quantum computing, I don't know, I'm not an expert on it, but it's the next step in computing power,
Right.
which is going to be a big jump
Yeah.
in the future, and we can only speculate about how that's going to affect our lives. But I think one obvious point is that the danger of too much technology is it simply takes away some of your everyday thinking.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, some of this new technology now that you can have in your home is that you can pull your car up, and the computer in the house knows that you've arrived, and
Yeah.
so the computer could say, switch the kettle on, have the kettle ready in
Yeah.
a few minutes, or I don't know, switch the television on, without
Right.
people having to think. This is the thing. if it takes away some of our basic thinking, well, that could be a bad thing because it means we're taking too much for granted, aren't we?
No, it is. It's kind of, I think guys like you and I, we come from a generation where there was a point where we had to learn how to read a map, like on paper.
Yeah, exactly.
And now with Google Maps and these mapping apps and software, like there's no need to ever know the direction or how to read a map, how to navigate a map, because through a GPS and these mapping apps, they tell us exactly how to go from point A to point B.
That's right. Yeah.
And now because I haven't really used a map or paper map or whatever, like if I had to, it would be a little bit more challenging. It kind of goes back to what we were talking about. We need to develop the muscle of a particular task.
Yeah.
If we're not developing the muscle, then we lose the ability to do it. And if computers are doing so much for us, we're not developing the muscles to do it ourselves. And so we are inherently kind of limiting our own capacities in certain ways.
Yeah, yeah. I'm sure you can see the bad side of that, and I certainly can, because, it's not so much our generation, but future generations growing up in an environment where everything is done for you. Mm-hmm. It means they're going to end up being a bit more helpless and just possibly just accepting things and not thinking for themselves. Right. We have to have, to a certain extent, our own independence, our ability to think for ourselves and to have your own opinion and not just be, just go along with anything that's presented out there. I think it's important to have your own opinion. Yeah. Is what's important. So, as far as future generations are concerned, well, they're never going to know any different, basically. But obviously, I'm from a time when, when I grew up, there was no internet.
Yeah.
The internet came along later on, and it was, amazing stuff. But I think that the future generations of kids growing up, they're not going to see it as such an amazing thing. They're just going to accept it's there, aren't they?
Right.
Do you see what I'm saying? They're not going to
completely.
Yeah, they're not going to see it as, wow, this is just so amazing that you can type in at the keyboard any question, do a Google search, and you can virtually get an answer, within a few seconds. Well, when I was growing up, we couldn't do that. You had to go down to the library, walk to the library, try and find the right book, right. And then, open the pages, look in the index of the book, and try and find what it was you were looking for. Whereas now, that just takes a few seconds on your keyboard, all that.
Yeah.
So things have changed so radically in the past, let's say, 30 years, haven't they?
Yeah. I actually have a very funny story to share that kind of encapsulate what we're discussing. I remember one of my first jobs right out of college. This was right at the cusp of the internet. To kind of build community within our department, the department manager has suggested that every morning or every Monday morning, each person, it would cycle, would get a chance to ask a difficult question and see who got it. And I remember the CFO, who was much older, 20 or 30 years older, he didn't understand that internet was so accessible, information was so accessible. So he would go to a very obscure book and find some sort of fact or knowledge from it. And that's a question he would send to the team. And he was like, there's no way anyone could know that. But we would be able to answer it within seconds because we just go online, type in the question, and we get the answer. And he was just shocked. He's like, how is that even possible? And it's exactly what you said, is that with the internet becoming so accessible, we can get most any knowledge at our fingertips. And it kind of moves away from what things were like before, because, when I grew up, there was an internet. I think internet was just kind of coming into the forefront near the end of my college days. But prior to that, there was actually an appreciation for holding, for learning, and being able to hold knowledge.
Hmm.
But now that doesn't really exist because whatever knowledge that person had learned or has memorized can be accessible by an internet search, an online search, a Google search, and we can get that knowledge very quickly. So, yeah, I totally know exactly what you're saying.
Mm. Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's important that in the future that education will include some of the techniques that you're talking about, the ability to try to remember, the ability to to develop a skill within the mind. I mean, at school we all did our times tables, didn't we?
Yeah.
2 times 2 is 4, 2 times 4 is 8, etc., and all
Right.
that. That is important, I think, because not to just rely on a computer all the time, to be able to do at least simple calculations from from within your own mind, and not have to rely on tools for absolutely everything.
Right.
Obviously, the internet is affecting that. There's good and there's bad. I mean, you can learn things more quickly, but you're also going to be possibly a bit lazy and just say, if I want it, it's there. It's there anytime I want it, so why should
Right.
I worry? But if for any reason it was taken away, it could be disastrous for people, because they might say,
Yeah.
this is what I've been depending on all my life. And if it's suddenly taken away, well, what would people do?
Yeah.
You see?
Yeah. I wanted to talk a little more into the future,
Yeah.
maybe past even humanity, and where, you know, it's just essentially artificial intelligence. And before I talk about that, I want to kind of go back into our past and start the story with Lucy, talking about, and I don't know if most people know, but Lucy is the oldest humanoid fossil ever discovered. She was discovered in Ethiopia. And when I was in Ethiopia on my, journey, I had the fortunate opportunity to see her. And it wasn't really as exciting as you would think. It was just some fossilized rock in a glass casing. But what was exciting was the exhibition that showed how we evolved from her. And there's a misconception that human evolution was linear. You know that image or poster that you see with us hunched on our all fours and then progressing to become upright?
Yeah.
Well, that isn't completely accurate. It wasn't that we moved from one to the next and to the next in a linear manner. The reality is that we were roaming the earth together. It's actually hard to imagine, but there was a time in human evolution where multiple intelligent species were roaming the planet at the same time. So, we are Homo sapiens, but there was also Homo neanderthal, as well as some other human-like species, one that was in Indonesia. And so the point that I'm trying to make is that many think that we humans are special or unique. But when you understand our past, in a way, we are not. We are just the ones who survived. And the question begs, like, why were we the only ones to survive? And there's many theories as to why. One theory suggests that Homo sapiens had separations of duties. So the men hunted and the women gathered. And this was advantageous because with the constant environmental changes, with the ice ages coming in and receding, if we couldn't rely on the skill of one, we could fall back on the skill of other. It was believed that Neanderthals, both the men and women, hunted, and so their skill they couldn't fall back on another skill. So that's one reason why one theory for why we survived. Another theory is that it's not that the other species went extinct, it's just that they kind of blended into us. So when you look at our genes, we're not full Homo sapiens. We have a little bit of Neanderthal, as well as, depending on what region the Homo sapiens were, they might have a little bit of the other human species genes in them. But the biggest theory is that we killed the other species off. It's like we humans have this innate thing to destroy anything that is different. And the fact that the genes of the other human species exist inside us means that they existed long enough for us to come into contact with them. But after we got into contact with them, they no longer existed. In fact, when we find fossils of other species, other human species, we see that they have marks from spears, the kinds of spears that we Homo sapiens used and hunted with. And you can kind of see this behavior of destroy anything that's different play out in just human evolution and Homo sapien evolution. You know, all the wars and genocides that we have, from America's conquest of the West to the British colonization of India and Australia. There have also been recent genocides in like Bosnia and Rwanda and Myanmar, and they aren't isolated to specific cultures or demographics. I mean, it was Caucasians that had the genocide in Bosnia, it was Africans in Rwanda, it was Asians in Myanmar. So it's almost as if we find any characteristics that makes us different to use that as an excuse to fight. And I guess my point is, like, as we start evolving and hopefully we become an interplanetary species like Elon Musk is trying to do, are we just going to continue that pattern of like, hey, these guys are from Mars, these Martians, we need to destroy them? Or our Martians are going to look at Earthlings and go, well, they're different, we need to wage a war against them. That's something like that's really important to think about for our own personal evolution, like this need to not isolate ourselves as different and then try to destroy and overcome them.
Yeah, okay, well that's a fair point. I mean, you know, it again is really difficult, I think, projecting this into the future.
Yeah.
You know, as for going out into space, we cannot predict what the situation would be. I mean, I honestly think it's too far ahead at this stage, and considering that AI, artificial intelligence, will play a massive role in the future of anything to do with space exploration.
Yeah.
And, you know, colonizing another planet and even developing faster spacecraft which are capable of traveling, you know, vast interstellar distances, which we can't really imagine. I mean, you know, it's rather like, think about Star Trek. You know, that these things, yes, one day they could be possible, but right now, of course, the limitations of the technology we have, we can't send a human being to another star system at this point in time. But that could change, possibly within 100 years or possibly even less. I mean, talking about Elon Musk, his aim, his goal, of course, is to get people to Mars,
right?
Which is, you know, which will be a major landmark,
right?
I personally think that's more a bigger landmark than sending people to the moon.
Yeah.
To get people to Mars, because Mars is the planet which is closest in nature to the Earth, although the atmosphere apparently is not very hospitable. But in terms of the size and in terms of the history of Mars, we know that there has been at one time a lot of running water on Mars, and that there is certainly a good reason to believe that Mars has been inhabited.
Yeah.
That the conditions would have been right for life to develop on Mars as it did on Earth. So it's the ability to go to Mars and explore it, I think, is probably something which is going to have a major impact on our future. And from there, it's just a question of, if we can develop, as I say, the technology to go further.
Yeah. To
even reach another star system which has planets on it, planets orbiting around it. This is, again, it's just, at this point in time, we can only compare it to kind of science fiction, but one day, these things should be possible.
Yeah, well, speaking of Elon Musk, we can go in so many directions because he is really paving the way for science fiction to become more reality. Just how quickly he is evolving the rocket systems, not just for us to go into space, but for the possibility of us to go into Mars. And I really like his mindset is fail fast. Just keep trying. Yeah. Not worry so much about making sure everything is perfect before testing. If it fails, then you know something went wrong, and then you work on fixing it, and then try again and fail. And that's really kind of the approach that when I look back at my life, that I have used is really just kind of fail fast. I just kind of go out and try a bunch of different things. If it doesn't work, I learn from the mistakes, try something different, and through that is how I have been able to kind of progress, especially through my healing. It was not dwelling on the mistakes. So it is really cool. And I do agree that Mars is such a bigger feat than the moon was, because the moon, the journey is only about 3 to 4 days out there.
That's right.
Yeah, and with Mars, it's about, I think, when Mars and Earth are closest to each other in their orbit, it's still like a 7-month journey just to get out there. And if we can get a human out there and back, that would be a feat of just astronomical proportions. And it would really pave the way for more exploration. But I do think that our future really depends also on us evolving AI. Not in terms of just using AI to help us, but just kind of evolving it to kind of go off on its own and do its own thing. Because in many ways, we humans are limited. First of all, for us to get good at anything requires habit. And once we formed habit, it's hard to change or break it. So once we've learned or become accustomed to something, it's actually difficult to change, and our habit will force us in staying the same way. But also we're limited in other ways. We have to be breathing oxygen every hour and minute and second of the day. We have to be eating on a regular basis. We can't have too much radiation, like minute amounts of radiation, as well as we have evolved to our bodies to function on a gravity that is the size of the Earth. But artificial intelligence, they're not restricted by these things. They're not restricted by the vacuum of space or the harshness of the radiation out in space, as well as this need to constantly be eating and almost, like if we wanted, we could put artificial intelligence into a state of hibernation and then bring it out. So I think it'd be really important to evolve AI to go out into territories and areas and parts of the solar system that we just will never be able to do, like just the way that we are built and the limitations that we have.
Yeah, that certainly is a good point, that it's the fragility of the human system which comes into play. And having said that, though, of course, computers and new technology may be able to remedy some of those limitations. For example, we've all seen those science fiction films where they actually do put some humans into hibernation, into suspended animation, and then they wake up and they've arrived at their destination, and it could have been many years before, the computer switches on all the hibernation system and gets them back to normal, starts the blood pumping around the body, etc. So, it's these things I think will be possible, and of course, the artificial intelligence will have a big role in assisting humans in getting to some of these destinations. So I think it's going to be exciting, but as I say, the danger is if artificial intelligence got to the point where it took over and kind of removed our ability to make decisions for ourselves. Then you have to say, well, surely the part of being human is that you can make mistakes. I think that's part of being human, isn't it? So so as I say, it's going to be a big topic for debate in the future.
As you were talking, all the different movies are flashing through my mind of humans being put into a state of suspended animation, or into, I think it was 2001 Space Odyssey, Interstellar, so all of those movies, and it'll be as well as Prometheus, and yes, artificial intelligence will be really an aid in that process, because we're going to rely on them to wake us up once we get to the destination.
That's right.
So it is quite interesting. And I can also see, I don't know if you ever saw 2001 Space Odyssey, but then there's also a sequel called 2010. And in 2010, they talked about how HAL took over. Well, in 2001, HAL kind of took over the spaceship and he killed off all the humans. But in 2010, they kind of explained why he did it. It was a programming of like protection and of self-preservation. So AI could try to take over us in an effort, in thinking that it was trying to do good. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, I can see what you're saying. It's we're getting into kind of, it's almost politics, really, the politics of it, as to what decisions humans can make, and should there be a stage at which humans are not capable of making the right decision, and AI may be able to make a better decision on behalf of humans. So it's just too much speculation, I think. At the end of the day, but it's an interesting subject to talk about. That's for sure. So anyway, it's been very nice talking to you, and I think that's been quite an interesting conversation. So I'd like to say thank you very much to Kam Knight for being with us today. Thank you very much to everybody for listening, and we'll speak to you again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anthony.
Thank you. Bye-bye.